Okay, welcome listeners to this episode in Exploring the BioEdge. Today we have a special guest, Margaret Moss from the United Kingdom, who is something of an expert in food and health. And our topic today, capitalizing on Margaret Moss's special experience, is the question of are dairy products a suitable food for people who are trying to maintain healthy lives in the modern world? What are the pros and cons of dairy products? Now, this is a difficult question because there's so much controversy and so much complexity in the topic. There are many different factors in dairy products that we need to consider. And what we'd like to help with here on Exploring the BioEdge is a context of natural history and biology, which may be missing in much of the literature and many of the discussions. The question is, what is the natural diet of a human? And given the complexity that comes with human omnivory, how do dairy products fit in? Because there will be pros and cons, and one needs a lot of knowledge and a lot of balance in one's considerations to assess, given also individual variation among humans, if and when and how to incorporate dairy products into a modern diet. Now, Margaret Moss not only understands many of the factors involved, but she herself has had a learning curve in her life in which she's experimented with various aspects of dairy products and can help us to assess the whole problem in context. So first of all, Margaret, welcome this evening. We're delighted to have you here. Could you please introduce yourself by sort of shouting out to listeners what you can help them with, because you are a consultant available to people, and then giving us a brief synopsis of your own journey through life, where you started, where you've been. You've had a very interesting life. And then once that's done, we'll get into the nitty-gritty and discuss all the different aspects of dairy products, ranging from proteins and amino acids through to sugars, vitamins, hormones, involvement in various diseases, and so on. Over to you, Margaret.
Right, so starting, in a sense, at the end of life rather than the beginning, and going backwards. What I do now, what I've done for some decades now, is work with people with chronic health problems, looking at diet, looking at nutritional supplements, looking at lifestyle. So they can be people with coronary heart disease, they can be people with cancer, they can be people with allergies, sensitivities, digestive problems, depression, schizophrenia, all sorts. If you think of a chemical factory and what you produce is not good quality, surely the first thing you will look at is what are the quality of the inputs? What are the raw materials put into this factory? Are they good quality? And if human health is poor, what is it that we're putting into that human animal that is leading to this? So it's a matter of looking mostly at people with chronic health problems, occasionally at people with more acute ones, and trying to work out the reasons why and what you can do about it, but particularly related to food and nutritional supplementation where you need particular things.
That's wonderful, Margaret. And what do you officially call yourself in your professional role?
I'm a nutritional therapist and I'm a chartered biologist.
And how can people contact you?
What most people do is go on nutritionist resource website, and they'll find some short articles that I've written there, so they'll get some idea whether I'm interested in people like them. And if they think that we can click, then they can just email me from that website. That's really the easiest way of doing it.
Okay, and can you briefly mention the various places you've lived and worked, because you've got unusually broad experience.
I spent 17 and a half years in Africa, partly in Kenya, partly in Zimbabwe. teaching and as a head teacher. So that gives me quite a different idea about food than for someone who's always lived in Britain and always bought their food at a supermarket or the local shop here. My grandfather actually had a small holding, so we grew up knowing more about food production than a lot of people do here. I've also friends in India and I've travelled there. And I think it's very important to understand that there is not one normal, perfect human diet. People in different areas have evolved different ways of feeding themselves depending on the environment there, on the climate there. But you learn a lot by mixing with people from different cultures and learning how they feed themselves.
Yes, and Africa is particularly relevant because the Maasai, for example, and certain other specialized pastoral groups in Africa seem to epitomize incorporating dairy in a positive way in their diets to the degree that, you know, the Maasai, the claim of the Maasai in their own cultural view of themselves is that they are essentially milk drinkers, or shall we say dairy product eaters as a specialization. But of course, it's not as simple as that. But the point is that there are people in Africa who revolve around dairy products, which makes it likely that there is a place for dairy products, even in something resembling a paleo diet, if one seeks to reconstruct such in a modern industrial setting. But your own research, you actually have peer-reviewed scientific publications in this field, and one of the more striking ones is a publication in which you showed a surprising and alarming correlation between coronary heart disease and milk consumption. Could you go into that a little, please?
Well, it is quite extraordinary. If you take different groups, and we looked at men of different age groups, so 65 to 74, 55 to 64, 45 to 54, and then we looked at the older women. And in every group, the correlation between milk intake and death from coronary heart disease, looking at different countries, was about 0.9, which is a huge correlation to have in biology. And we also looked at a change, not just the changes between one country and another, but changes over time. In a lot of countries we looked at, and we did choose the ones where the statistics are fairly reliable, milk consumption has reduced, and it takes about 10 years after milk consumption starts reducing and coronary heart disease death reduces. You do have to look. If milk is something that people are drinking all their lives, it's no use looking at how much they drink at the time they die. You need to look at it further back to give some idea of over a lifetime, and we use 17 years between drinking the milk and the death, which gave us these figures. Portugal increased milk consumption, increased coronary heart disease death, but all these other countries we looked at in Europe, it was the opposite, that milk consumption went down. 10 years later, coronary heart disease death in those four categories, the older women and the different age groups of men, they all dropped at about the same time, 10 years later.
And Margaret, your view 20 years after publishing that paper is that the galactose could be a causal agent there in generating that high correlation. Is there
no correlation between cheese consumption and death from coronary heart disease? So what happens when you go from milk to cheese? You get rid of the sugar. So it does suggest that this galactose may well be a key problem. It's probably a whole lot of things. milk fat globule membrane, which seems to be a problem. A lack of taurine, which is a useful amino acid. We can make taurine. Cats can't. If you feed a kitten or a lion cub cow milk, it will be blind because it won't have the taurine, it can't make it. So, and taurine keeps the heart, the electrics of the heart working properly, controls the beating of the heart. There's an awful lot of calcium in milk, and calcium and magnesium need to be in balance. And where's the magnesium in milk? It's not a source of magnesium. So that may be part of it, but that would also apply to cheese. I mean, you could correct that by, if you have some milk and together with it you have some green leafy vegetables, then you can correct that balance. But if you just have the milk and you don't have magnesium, you're likely to be in problems because calcium and magnesium compete for uptake. And so the more calcium you have, the worse your magnesium status will be. Milk has a lot of methionine in it, which is an amino acid, and it's not very good in most of the B vitamins you need to prevent a build-up of something called homocysteine from methionine. That may also play a part between them. So milk, I don't think anyone should be drinking milk once you've been weaned by your mother. It's got lactose in it, which has to be broken down into glucose and galactose. Galactose is a particularly toxic sugar. For some reason, mammals give it to their offspring, and I guess there must be a reason for this. I don't know what it is, but really it's not something you want to keep on having. Galactose, as far as we can see, is very much part of the cause of coronary heart disease because it damages the lining of arteries. Why does it? Because it glycates. The sugar attaches, for instance, to cholesterol. Cholesterol is fine so long as it doesn't have this stuff attached to it. And when that's attached, then it becomes oxidized and then it becomes dumped in artery walls, and the arteries become narrower and more likely to block. So I don't see why anyone needs to have milk once they're weaned by their mother. Personally, I eat goat cheese. Why? I think I probably have a problem with cow milk protein. You could equally have a problem with goat milk protein. I did come across a case of a little boy who was suspected of having cancer, but actually it was allergy to cow milk protein. So he grew up where they grew goats, and therefore he had an allergy to goat protein. So whatever you've been brought up on, you can have built up an allergy to, and changing to another animal is a good idea. So it's very important when people come to see me as a nutritionist and they say they have problems with milk, for me to try to work out, is it the sugar that's bothering them, or is it the protein? If it's a protein, change to a different animal. If it's the milk, we'll make sure you only have butter, cheese, possibly yogurt, but don't have milk as such. Milk statistically is hugely correlated with death from coronary heart disease. It was never meant as an adult food, and it shouldn't be. There are other things in milk. There's a membrane around the fat globules in milk, and people with advanced coronary heart disease have high antibodies to something in this membrane. And this would appear to have something to do with clotting. We did publish an article, and we've photos there of how antibodies to this milk fat globule membrane cause platelets to clump together, which can cause clots. And also it has an effect on natural killer cells, so it may have a connection with cancer. So I feel you have to distinguish between the animals, and you have to distinguish between what part of the milk. If you live in hot, dry places, you probably don't have a lot of cattle, although you may have. But nearer to the poles, where it's difficult to grow crops, people have kept animals, and milk has become a big part of diet, or the various parts of milk have. It seems to me that our ancestors knew what to do with milk. You made cheese and butter out of it. You didn't actually drink that much milk. But with refrigeration, we've forgotten about this. People underestimate how much milk they consume, because it's not just what you drink. And anyway, how many people remember how many cups of coffee they had at work and exactly how much milk they put in them? But there's a lot of hidden milk in the Western diet. Powdered soup with milk powder in, sausages with skim milk in, vodka where milk can be used to clarify the alcohol, also other alcoholic drinks, but particularly vodka. You know, the custard tart and so on, especially where people don't know how to cook. They're not aware. Some of us who know how to cook would know a custard tart had a lot of milk in it, but if you've never cooked, then you can be quite naive about what is in things. So people may think, oh, I don't use much milk. I just buy maybe, 5 litres for a family of 5 for a week or something.
Yeah.
But they don't realise that it's all over the place. If you consume processed food, then you will be consuming lots and lots of milk, unbeknown to you.
Yep. And there's even, whey protein in the special supplements that people take at the gym for bodybuilding and so on.
That's true.
It's as if people think that the proteins in milk whey are the best proteins for certain aspects of bodybuilding or health.
Who knows? It would appear that the problem with milk fat globule membrane is a kind of allergic problem, but not to do with IgE, the common antibody we think of with allergies. So it could well be multifaceted. I mean, you can understand why cultures use milk and why cultures use eggs. Because if you kill your cow, you've lost your capital. If you kill your hen, you've lost your capital, whereas you can keep on eating eggs and keep on drinking milk and the capital remains. So you can understand why this happens. You can understand why in parts of the world where it's difficult to grow crops, you keep animals. So there are historical reasons. There is a suggestion that people who die of coronary heart disease often have poor thyroid activity, and this makes people subject to infection. And before antibiotics, those people tended to die of TB, so they never got as far as dying of a heart attack. And in a way, we have been successful in keeping these people alive longer. They don't die of the TB, so they have time to die of a heart attack, so their lives are longer. So this may be why milk hasn't been seen as a big problem in the past, because people's lives tended to be shorter anyway.
That's very interesting.
If you think that galactose narrows the lumen, the center of the artery, the thing about the Maasai is that they walk many, many miles a day. They have so much exercise. They have the fitness of Olympic athletes. So all that exercise opens the arteries up So yes, the Maasai's arteries do have deposits in them, but because the arteries are otherwise so big, the deposits don't close those arteries down. Whereas for sedentary people, if they then get narrowed arteries, then they're more likely to block.
Very interesting indeed. This is such a bewildering palette of topics. It's hard to know where to begin, but let's go back to one of the more basic aspects of the pros and cons of dairy products, which is the sugars, because many listeners will be aware at least of the problem of lactose intolerance. And let's look at what lactose is and how galactose fits into that. Now, milk contains sugar, presumably because for the infant bovine, sugar is a ready source of energy for growth and activity. But the trouble with this sugar is that from the diet, from the perspective of diets for humans, it's essentially a toxic sugar, and it's toxic in two different ways. The first way is that lactose causes an intolerance response in many dairy consumers or milk consumers. Lactose in itself, as a complex sugar, causes a kind of a rebellion on the part of the human gut and system. And then secondly, even if you manage to break down lactose, even if you manage to overcome your own lactose intolerance, what you release is two sugars, glucose and galactose, one of which, namely galactose, is actually a toxin for humans. That isn't to say that it's completely a toxin. When you yourself are a human infant, you need galactose for your brain development and so on. But once you're adult, as far as I can see, there's very little role for galactose in the human physiology. And so galactose is essentially a toxic aspect of dairy products that the technology of dairy production seeks to eliminate as much as possible. And it gets complicated because the main way of eliminating galactose is to allow microbes to ferment and destroy it, but they're very reluctant to do so. And if you do what the Maasai do, which is to allow your milk to ferment naturally, to clabber, that still doesn't get rid of the galactose because the bacteria involved, the lactobacilli, eat the sugar first and then leave the galactose, which means that you have to really process your dairy products almost to the point of being unrecognizable as dairy products before you finally get rid of that toxic sugar, galactose. Does that more or less summarize the problem, Margaret?
I think so, and this is why I'm all for eating hard cheese, because you ferment it, but then you press it, and you press out the whey, and you press out the sugar, and you're left with a much safer food. So I say the opposite of what most doctors say. Doctors will tend to say, oh, you can't have fatty hard cheese, but you can have, your low-fat cottage cheese. I say no, because the cottage cheese hasn't been pressed. If you're worried about the sugar, you want to press your cheese. The trouble is, industry is not going to throw that away. If it presses it, that waste product will go into the sausages or somewhere else.
Yes. But given that
if you yourself are simply saying, I'm only going to eat hard blocks of cheese, then that is, I think, your best way of avoiding galactose.
Yes, so cheese we can agree is a way of at least getting rid of the sugar problem in milk. But as taking a step back, one has to ask oneself, well, if the way to process dairy to the point of acceptability is really to just select out the protein in it, ultimately, is there any reason to remain a dairy consumer? Because you can get perhaps more balanced protein more easily by just consuming animal flesh or perhaps eggs. So ultimately, what are the pros of cheese, in the spectrum of foods available to humans?
Cheese is of course a very useful food if you've got to keep it for a while. If you're traveling, meat's going to go off. Cheese it will go moldy in the end, but That's an advantage of it, isn't it? And not consuming your capital, that has to be a reason why you would eat cheese.
Yes. So from a pastoral person's point of view, cheese would seem to be much of the solution. But it's interesting, is it not, that the Maasai don't really make cheese? As I understand it, they do basically two things with their dairy milk. They first of all ferment it to clabber, which is an amazingly spontaneous process. You don't need to inoculate milk with lactobacillus to make clabber, which is like a sort of proto yogurt. All you need to do is just leave it in the gourd in which you've collected it on the in your kitchen, in your primitive kitchen, if you're living in a wattle and daub structure in the East African plains, and it will naturally somehow recruit lactobacillus, apparently out of the air or maybe out of the original milk, and it will naturally clabberize and form this delicious, slightly clotty, slightly sour substance, which the Maasai consume in moderate quantities. And apparently they also make butter, particularly for their own infants. But as far as I know, the Maasai do not actually ferment or process their milk to the point of creating cheese. Is that correct?
As far as I know, yes. Of course, you put your milk into your gourd, and there's already the fermented product there that will now ferment the next lot of milk and the next lot of the milk and the next. So once you've got your milk fermenting, then every time you put fresh milk in, this will happen.
This is true, and I've done some kitchen experiments here in my own, home, in which I've compared and contrasted the performance of pasteurized milk with raw milk. Now, as we know, in most Western countries, the consumption of raw, unpasteurized milk is not encouraged, and in some places it's banned legally. But you can get it, on the pretense that it's for pets or for a special health product and so on. And if you take unpasteurized dairy milk and you just pour it out of the container and just leave it standing on the kitchen shelf, in my experience, it fairly reliably turns into wholesome clabber, which indicates that even, without that spontaneous inoculation of the Maasai gourd, there is some process, some microbiological process in which lactobacillus gets into the milk, the fresh milk, and prevails and predominates over competing microbes to produce fairly reliably a wholesome clabber. And so, people generally think that milk becomes unwholesome when stale, when left outside of the fridge, but that's not strictly true. That's true for pasteurized milk, in which the sort of bacterial seed, as it were, has been destroyed, and the protein structure of the milk has also been altered by heat. And so, in its natural state, milk basically turns into clabber, which is as wholesome as you can get for something that's minimally processed as a dairy product. And so the whole microbiology of milk is fascinating and complex. And I've pursued this to the point that I've tried to keep fermenting milk beyond the clabber stage, beyond the yogurt stage, to a point where the galactose seems finally to have been got rid of. And I've been disappointed to find that doesn't seem to happen until you've actually turned your milk to vinegar, at which point there's no real point in consuming it because it's no longer either useful or even recognizably a dairy product. And so I have to agree with you based on my own, decades-long experience that if you want to get rid of the sugar problem in milk, which consists of, again, of two problems, the lactose problem and the component of the lactose called galactose, basically the only way to do that is to make cheese, which is essentially to get rid of the milk altogether, get rid of the whey fraction and its sugar content altogether, and simply to select out from the original milk the protein component. But now there's another complete category of problems in milk, which is the hormonal content, because milk is originally a product designed by biology for infants. And so it not only feeds infants, but it also acts as a hormonal food, a food containing hormones and stimulating hormonal activity in the infant mammal. And because the producer of the milk is a female, there are two different categories of hormones and pro-hormones in milk that may be relevant. One is the hormones that promote growth and development in an infant mammal, which are inappropriate for an adult consumer like a human adult. And secondly, there are the sort of feminine or feminizing hormones that reflect the maternal status of the mother, that again may affect the human adult in terms of disrupting the normal balance between testosterone and other hormones in our own bodies. And again, what's surprising and perhaps alarming about this is that these hormonal products are somewhat resistant to fermentation, and they persist even in butter, which is, again, we've mentioned that cheese is a great way of getting rid of the whey protein, the whey sugars, and many of the problems in milk to render it wholesome. But the same is true for butter in a sense that it gets rid of the protein and the whey, and it just selects out the fat, which is a healthy saturated fat full of very useful butyric acid as an amino acid. But the problem again is that even in the butter stage, you tend to retain the hormonal component because the hormones tend to be steroids or related hormones that are attached to the fat. Could you elaborate on that to some degree if you have experience with it?
I think it's something we don't know enough about, but it does seem odd, especially to be feeding men on this product.
Yes, it sounds like it's
female cow's product. Why are we feeding male humans on it? So, but whether anyone's actually done much work on that, I doubt. The trouble is that the money going into milk research tends to be to say, look, milk's wonderful. It has all the things a calf needs. It's got protein, it's got fat, it's got carbohydrates, it's got minerals, it's got vitamins. Isn't it wonderful? That's where the money is. There really isn't money for research like what we did. We weren't paid to do what we did. It's just what the dairy industry does not want done.
That's right. Well, I've come to the suspicion myself that and I can't substantiate this with peer-reviewed publications, but I suspect that part of the reason for the widespread prostate problems in Western societies, in which men over 50 become plagued by hyperplasia of the prostate, and in some cases prostate cancer, is not only because we consume too much sugar in every respect and we disrupt our whole insulin physiology, but also because specifically the hormones in dairy products and possibly also egg yolks are fundamentally disruptive to our male hormonal health, and that plays merry hell with our prostates. And even in the case of cheese, I think it's only in the most processed, the most fermented, the most derived kinds of cheeses that you finally get rid of the hormonal component of the dairy. And this possibility may be worth considering because prostate problems are so widespread in men, in middle-aged to older men in Western societies, that it's really a puzzling phenomenon from a biological or evolutionary point of view. How can it possibly be the case that a natural organ just sort of systemically atrophies and becomes a problem for the second half of one's life? There must be something very fundamental that we're doing wrong, a bit like fish swimming in water and not realizing that there's such a thing as water. We seem to be doing something in Western societies that's all around us and unrealized by us that is corrupting our prostate health. And so from the point of view of both the sugars in milk and the hormones in milk, I suspect that we can explain part of the prostate problem. And of course, the sugar problem goes way beyond milk because we're drenched in sugar and particularly fructose in almost everything we buy on the supermarket shelf. And I think you also have some comments on fructose to make. Is that not so?
Yes, indeed. If you eat glucose or starch, which breaks down to glucose, we're pretty efficient at taking that glucose out of the gut and into the bloodstream. We're not very good at doing it with either galactose or fructose. So you tend to have fructose left in the gut, and that feeds various organisms you'd rather not have. But another side to it, we found that 5 major cancers out of the 8 we studied, the highest correlation was with sugar. Death from those cancers was with sugar. And there is research showing that fructose provides the raw material to make DNA, so that a cancer cell can make genetic material to make more cancer cells, to make lumps, and worse, to metastasize. That seems a hugely important thing. There are a lot of people who are saying carbohydrate feeds cancer cells, glucose feeds cancer cells. Well, glucose feeds all cells. But fructose seems to have this particularly malign effect of enabling the production of more cancer cells, which is just what you don't want.
That's very interesting, because, I mean, fructose, it's yet another example of the maddening complexity and maddening contradictions that you find in the topic of human diets, because fructose is primarily associated with fruit, and fruit is primarily regarded as a natural, healthy product. But even that is not true anymore today, because firstly, there's just simply too much fruit around in a way that does not, reflect our original environment at all. And secondly, our fruit species, our domesticated fruit species, have been kind of frankenfruited, in the sense that through selective breeding, they're essentially genetically modified to be unnaturally sweet. And so, in my own personal journey, my own sort of, I would call it an odyssey through dietary experimentation and choices in my own life, I've gone through the complete arc of starting as a juvenile not particularly eating fruit, and then going heavily onto fruit for literally decades in an attempt to restore a natural diet, and then finally, in my elderly years, seeing through the myth of fruit and basically rejecting it from my diet altogether, with the exception of certain fruits in small quantities, like, for example, guavas, which are unusually rich in vitamin C and not very sweet, and not really subjected to much selective breeding. And so I'll accept guavas even when they're fly blown, and even when they're not fully ripe, because to my mind, guavas are a smart choice of fruit in a kind of a nightmarish cafeteria experiment that's been performed on the human race, in which we've been basically intoxicated with fruit. And what's dismaying about all of this is that it's taken me literally decades to come through to the end of this maze of trial and error. But it highlights again that almost every aspect, every component of food that we consider in the modern world has pros and cons. Fruit is indeed a natural part of our diets, because we, as omnivores, we did eat fruit in our paleo environment. But it's also the case that fructose is essentially a toxin in anything more than small quantities. And so one has to keep weighing up the pros and cons and come to some kind of balanced decision in all of these things. Now, even looking at the proteins, I think that when you look at casein, which is the basic protein in milk, it consists of certain amino acids, and there's a lot of discussion to be had about whether the overall amino acid balance is a sound one. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, funnily enough, for me, it's a good balance. I mean, it's taken me a long odyssey to find out what my own problems are, and one of them is that I have a problem with glycine, and so meat for me is very difficult because it's full of glycine, whereas there isn't that much in milk. And the things that protect you from glycine are methionine and arginine. And so if I'm trying to work out what protein is good for me, I take twice the glycine level, subtract one of the methionine level and one of the arginine level, and if that is high, I avoid the food. So for me, eating goat cheese is a lifesaver. Eating meat is a big problem, but that's me because I have my own specific issues.
Overall, would you whey protein is something that's in the public consciousness as a as a supplement for bodybuilding, which implies that whey protein in some sense is a healthy component of dairy products. Overall, what do you think about whey proteins?
Personally, I think people should eat food. I'm not keen on people eating proteins out of tins.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a crafty way of using the whey. You know, when you make the cheese, you squeeze out the whey. What do you do with it? Oh, well, sell whey protein. It's not something you would encourage. Going back to fructose, there are two, apart from that it encourages cancer, there are two chronic problems people can have with fructose. One is fructose malabsorption. You can transport a small amount of fructose into the bloodstream from the gut, but if you have a lot of it, you can't transport it, and it will be there and it will feed harmful bacteria. And the quantity of fructose, not just from fruit, far more from sugar, honey, etc., high fructose corn syrup. It's too much. There's no way you can transport it, and that can lead you to have gut problems, IBS or worse, particularly ulcerative colitis. Ulcerative colitis is rather crafty. You have sulfate-reducing bacteria in the gut. They use fructose as fuel, and they take the oxygen out of sulfate in order to be able to, if you like, burn the fuel for energy. And that leaves sulfide, and sulfide attacks the gut wall, leading to ulcerative colitis and very likely colon cancer. So that's quite a specific thing there.
Very interesting.
But something else, which I also have, is not fructose malabsorption, it's fructose intolerance, which means that I cannot process fructose, and therefore it does become a poison to me. Can lead to terribly, terribly low blood sugar. The kind of so low blood sugar you're just screaming for food, and presumably the brain needs the food. You actually do need to have some. It's not good to have your blood sugar so low. So that doesn't happen in a lot of people. The malabsorption is much more common. Another thing to look at is it doesn't apply to the equator where you can have fruit all year round, but in areas like Britain where I am, fruit grows, late summer, early autumn. And it was quite useful if you had some fructose when you were in the Stone Age. It fattened you up because fructose is the big cause of obesity. It fattened you up. In winter, there was very little food. You lived on that fat and you survived to spring. That does not apply now because you can go to the supermarket and buy sugar, fruit, honey, etc. all year round.
Yes, well, that introduces a whole can of worms in terms of obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome, because as many listeners will be aware, many of the modern health problems in chronic disease are caused by too much carbohydrate, both in quantity and in frequency, which really upsets our whole insulin metabolism. And according to the individual, will lead to cancer or obesity or diabetes or various other ills.
Or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Yes,
is a fructose disease.
Yes.
You really should talk about alcoholic fatty liver disease and fructose fatty liver disease rather than saying it's non-alcoholic. I think that might get across a bit better what's going on. The liver will convert fructose to fat.
I see. So what fruit as a food category and dairy as a food category have in common is that they're fundamentally problematic in terms of their carbohydrate content, their sugar content, in different ways, but they're both sugar problems.
When you were a hunter-gatherer, you didn't want to eat something that was very tart, because it might well be poisonous. And so we have a natural desire for sweet things because they were less likely to poison us.
That's right. And in the original anthropological setting, I dare say that fruit was actually quite a rare thing in the sense that, I've taken an interest in bush foods or natural wild foods for most of my life. And in my experience, if you're in any kind of natural forest or scrub or savanna environment in the world, it's actually quite difficult to get hold of fruit for a couple of reasons. Firstly, most wild fruits which have not been subjected to selective breeding and domestication are actually quite unpleasant to eat. They're not sweet. They're often sour. They're usually astringent. And, they're certainly useful from a vitamin point of view, but they're not normally sweet. There are sweet fruits out there, but fruits in general tend to be taken by birds and monkeys, primates, to the degree that if you're walking around in the African bush, you've usually been pipped to the post by some other animal to get the ripe fruits. And so just wandering around as a hunter-gatherer in the world, you will be eating some fruit, particularly seasonally, but it's not as if fruit is a major category of food in the way that it is on a supermarket shelf. And so our natural environment did include fruit. This is, again, the maddening contradiction. You have to somehow come into a sort of contextual balance in order to understand the role of these various food categories in our natural human diet. Fruit was certainly an important category of food for the original hunter-gatherer, but it wasn't anything like the modern fruit. And that leads again to a whole different category of concern in dairy products, which is the mineral nutrient profile, because fruit is a wonderful source of potassium, but it's woefully devoid of most other mineral nutrients, again including magnesium. And so let's discuss for a little while the mineral profile of milk. You've already mentioned that it's rich in calcium, but woefully poor in magnesium. What about other elements such as, for example, molybdenum, boron, and so on? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't want people to have a lot of boron because it depletes vitamin B2. So I'm not so worried about that one. Plants definitely need boron. Milk is not a good source of molybdenum. It's not a good source of zinc, and calcium will act against zinc. It's not a good source of iron. If you're going to be vegetarian, it's not going to solve that very much. How much selenium? Well, how much of any mineral in is going to depend on the pasture, isn't it? And part of our problem is we tend to have our cattle in fields. So if the pasture's limited, then neither the cattle nor the people who live in the cattle are going to be well nourished. There was a scientist who went around farms in this country and tested the soil and would say, the reason your cattle are doing badly is your soil is deficient in, say, in selenium, so do something about it. And they would do. And the livestock would become so healthy that suddenly the farm became much, much more profitable, to the extent that the tax authorities became suspicious. How come you're making so much profit now and you didn't declare a profit like this previous years? Were you cheating?
Yes.
So it had a dramatic effect.
Yes.
So, the crops you grow, the animals you eat, or their products like milk and eggs, it's going to depend so much on the quality of the soil. And we've been using fertilizers for years now on so much of our soil, putting NPK in, but forgetting about all the other minerals. And the soils are becoming more and more depleted and less healthy.
Yes, and so let's pick on selenium for a moment because it's a particularly intriguing mineral nutrient. It's very easy to be subclinically deficient in selenium in the modern world, and it is true also that if the dairy herd is nourished on a particularly selenium-rich soil, then some of that selenium will find its way into the milk. But it's also true that in the balance of factors, it's easier just to supplement your selenium by eating 2 Brazil nuts a day because Brazil nuts are unusually rich in selenium, and that kind of does the trick. So again,
As an
there's not really
individual,
much.
yes, but if you're thinking of how to make your whole population of your country healthy, it makes sense to do as the Finns have and put selenium on the soil.
Yes, and some of it will get into the Finnish population by way of the dairy products, and that I think that's true as well for.
They did this.
I see. Yes, that raises the topic of a related nutrient, iodine, and again there is some iodine in milk, but it's been widely put into milk artificially as well as a way of increasing the iodine intake of the population. Is that not so?
Or, I mean, other places, they put it into salt.
That's right. Now, coming back to calcium, again, I'm trying to stand back from this bewildering maze of considerations and get some overall balance. So what we seem to be agreeing on is that the sugar in fruit is essentially a toxin. The sugar in dairy products is essentially a toxin. And the calcium in dairy products is essentially a toxin. And that's an alarming realization, because the dairy industry would love us to believe that the calcium in milk is the best thing since sliced bread, and that's essential for our bone formation and general health, to the degree that people are indoctrinated to drink milk for the calcium. But what you're saying, I think, is that the calcium is the problem in milk. It's a con, not a pro. Is that right?
Well, it's like so many things. You want some of it, but not too much. It's the old Goldilocks principle. You know, Goldilocks tries this bed, it's too hard. She tries that bed, it's too soft. This bed is just right. You need some calcium, but not too much of it.
Yes, and you can get calcium from leafy greens, and so there's no specific reason to have dairy products in any form for the calcium, because firstly you can get calcium.
If you live on the equator, you have lots of vitamin D from the sunshine, so you'll absorb your calcium pretty well.
Yes.
Whereas if you live far north, you actually will need more calcium.
And that introduces... Yeah. Go ahead, Anthony.
Sorry, if I could jump in and ask you, Margaret, if you have enough vitamin K2, is the high level of calcium in milk still problematic? Because my understanding is that K2 can assist in ensuring the calcium goes to the right parts of the body, namely the bones, as opposed to the artery walls. But perhaps it still floods out the magnesium. Is that the problem?
You still need to make sure you get plenty of magnesium, but you could get that from your green leafy vegetables. So in that case, you could eat your cheese so long as you had your green leafy vegetables. Yes, and that's another reason for having fermented milk, whether it's yogurt or cheese, because it will have vitamin K2 in it.
Yeah.
Ordinary milk won't.
Okay, so there are some ways to potentially counter the problems in milk. But if you go to your average cardiologist and show them your incredible correlation of 0.9 across 15 countries, I think it was, and say, sorry, how many?
22.
22 countries, right. If you say to the cardiologist, well, look at this correlation, and you discuss the calcium magnesium ratio problem and the galactose deposition in the arteries problem and the immune response problem and the taurine problem, is the cardiologist going to argue against those causal mechanisms, or is this actually mainstream thinking that all those aspects are potential problems? Are they individually accepted, but the overall conclusion that milk is a major problem because of all these factors is not being acknowledged, or not? Would they push back against these individual problems that you've mentioned?
I think the amount of nutrition known by most cardiologists would mean they would have no idea what you were talking about. And I think this was done deliberately so that doctors would prescribe drugs rather than diet. I think all this money that's poured into medical schools by drugs industry means that we turn out doctors who know very little nutrition. Certainly one doctor said to me that there was no nutrition training whatsoever in his medical degree. I mean, other than Mrs. Smith is anemic of iron. I mean, that was the level of it. He said that the last time he formally studied nutrition was at his secondary school, not at the university at all. So yes, and the other thing is that cardiology has been indoctrinated by the idea that fat is bad, and that was built on looking at 6 countries, picking 6 countries out of the 22 for which the figures were available, using the 6 countries that would give that conclusion. You could have picked another 6 and had exactly the opposite conclusion. But although we know that that was fraud, most doctors still believe that. And then there was the erroneous research done by the Russians, I don't know, something like 100 years ago, feeding rabbits oxidized cholesterol. Well, rabbits don't eat cholesterol anyway, never mind that it's been oxidized. And their bodies don't know what to do with it, and not surprisingly, they had problems. But if you give oxidized cholesterol to people, that's not going to do any good. And that gets us back to another thing is there's good and bad food processing. And if you make milk powder, and if you make egg powder, then you are going to oxidize the cholesterol in them. They seem to keep, they don't go moldy, but they become damaged.
Yes. So,
but, your doctor's still trying to get you to take a statin drug to reduce the cholesterol, even though that's an important part of your body.
Yes. Well, overall, Anthony and Margaret, what are your views on the fatty acid and lipid profile of dairy products? Because we've already discussed sugars, proteins, hormones, and so on. But if you were to overall to characterize the fatty acids in milk and its derivatives, would you say that overall they tend to be on the healthy side or the unhealthy side?
I would say healthy. Butyric acid is very useful. Short chain fatty acid, saturated, mends your gut wall. Why do so many people have what they call leaky guts? Well, there are all sorts of reasons, but among them either trying to follow low-fat diets or eating margarine rather than butter.
Yes. So would you say that overall butter, like
hard
cheese,
butter is good, not spreadable butter, but the real thing, yes.
Yes.
Even better if you convert it to ghee, because you pick out some of the impurities from it.
Yes, ghee is a kind of an ultimate butter product in the sense that they've got almost all of the whey minerals, whey proteins out of it, and they've clarified it to the point that it's just basically saturated fat. Is that not so?
Yes.
Yeah. But I think it may still contain the hormones, unfortunately. Nobody studied it.
Well, fats do tend to... So many objectionable things are fat soluble, aren't they?
Yes. Could we just turn back to vitamins for a moment, considering all the various vitamins, A, the various forms of B, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin K. Overall, what does milk and its products feature in terms of vitamins? What are the highlights and what are the cons of dairy products as a source of vitamins in human diets?
Well, there'll be some D.
Yeah.
There'll be some A. I mean, those are, and K2 if it's been fermented.
Yes. It's not much of a source of vitamin C, is it?
There's some B2.
Yeah.
Vitamin C, no.
It sounds like
K1.
overall, it sounds like overall milk and its derivatives are not a particularly rich source of vitamins. Is that correct?
Well, nowadays you can go and buy vitamin D supplements, but here in the north, where we don't get a lot of vitamin D from the sun, I think it is useful that you can get some vitamin D from dairy products.
But is the vitamin D in dairy products a natural component produced by the body of the lactating bovine, or is it being introduced industrially as a supplement by governments for human health? Because I think they do enrich vitamin D in milk in some places, do they not?
They don't here.
I see.
Well, margarine has vitamin D added so that it can mimic milk in that sense.
I see. Yes. Yeah,
I
vitamin
think
D.
in America they put vitamin D. I have a feeling they put vitamin D in milk in America.
Right.
They do
Vitamin
more
D seems,
than we do.
yeah, it seems to be a particularly important vitamin in the sense that large blocks of the population in the world are subclinically deficient in vitamin D without realizing it, mainly because, in the Western world, we've become very, very sun phobic. We're encouraged to slip, slop, slap, and protect ourselves from sun. And so even in sunny climates, for example, in Mediterranean climates, I think much of the population is subclinically deficient in vitamin D simply because they're not sunning themselves enough out of fear of melanoma and skin cancer. And in the absence of having enough sunshine, the population is hard put to find vitamin D in any other source. Now, in the old days, when before I was born and maybe into my childhood, say 50 years ago, it was a widespread practice to have cod liver oil as a supplement, which was wonderful for vitamin D, and it's a shame that that culture has been lost in the modern day. But I think you can elaborate as to a con that balances that pro, because I think your view would be that cod liver oil, although wonderfully rich in vitamin D, is actually toxic with vitamin A. Could you elaborate?
Well, here in Britain, the state gave my generation large quantities of cod liver oil. I think it was a whole dessert spoon a day for a small infant. It was far too much, and I gather some of the babies died, and some of them, like me, have very short, long bones because they turned to bone and the cartilage was lost and they couldn't continue growing. That happened prematurely. So you again, you're back to Goldilocks. You need some vitamin A, but not too much. And of course, when it comes to pregnancy, you can't produce a baby without some vitamin A. But on the other hand, too much is going to lead to things like spina bifida. So it was, I think, in the 1940s, they saw vitamins as good things. They didn't really think you could get too much of a good thing. And really, the vitamin that you have to be most careful with is vitamin A, just as the mineral you have to be most careful about is selenium, not to get too much.
Yes, indeed. And I think there's a widespread misconception out there that you can be intoxicated with vitamin D in much the same way as you can with vitamin A, on the basis that both are fat-soluble vitamins. And I've looked into the research on this, and apparently this is not true. It is very easy to become toxic in vitamin A, for example, if you eat too much liver or too much cod liver oil. But apparently with vitamin D, it's a very safe vitamin. It's very difficult to have too much of it. Whether you sun yourself or you have it in an oral form, like in vitamin D capsules that you can get from the pharmacy, it's apparently almost impossible to overdose. And so
the only problem is if you have a very high calcium diet.
I see.
And the vitamin D will increase the absorption of the calcium.
I see. So it's an indirect toxicity.
The other thing about the absorption of calcium is you will absorb more calcium from milk because of the sugar. The sugar is partly there, yes, because it's easy to feed the infant, but it's also there to aid the absorption of calcium. If you think of a calf, if it can't learn to stand up pretty quickly, someone's going to eat it.
Yes.
So it's essential for it to absorb the calcium in its mother's milk, and that's partly why the sugar is there.
Yes, yes. Very interesting. It's interesting that human milk seems to be poorer in protein and fat, but richer in sugar, relatively speaking, than bovine milk. Is that correct?
I think you could be right about that. Certainly, human milk is much poorer in calcium because the human baby doesn't need to stand up and isn't
Yes.
going to stand up very quickly.
Well, that's right. It's a fundamental fact that the bovine animal, the ruminant animal, grows so much faster than the human that human milk and bovine milk are essentially incomparable as foods for infants, because the human infant is extremely slow growing in the context of mammals in general, whereas the ruminant infant is extremely fast growing. And so dairy milk is designed as a superfood, as it were, for an extremely, almost explosively growing infant that needs to pack on protein and muscle and bone very, very quickly, and is also extremely active. And so one of the fundamental problems of dairy products, which you have to stand well back to see in context, is that it's just too rich as a food for the human species. We're not designed for a food of that caliber unless we sort of water it down, ferment it, temper it, mollify it, eliminate some of its extremeness in our diet. So we've covered sugars, proteins and amino acids, lipids, vitamins, hormones, mineral nutrients. Are there any other aspects that we need to touch on?
Well, could we just go back to the calf for a moment? One of the problems the mother has is that all she can do is fight you if you come too near her calf. Whereas human beings can walk on two legs so they can pick their babies up and run away from danger with the baby. Otherwise, human babies would not live very long, would they?
No, that's right. Yes.
But,
yes.
So somehow that calf has got to become able to run away itself because the mother can't lift it up, and therefore it must have lots of calcium.
That's fascinating.
It's very fast, whereas our babies don't.
Yes, and this precociality in ruminant infants is taken to its extreme in wildebeests, which not only are as precocial as most ruminants, but are so precocial indeed that literally within minutes, like within 10 minutes, the newborn can actually get up and start locomoting. It's quite spectacular, because that animal lives in a way in which the only way that the infant survives is by being precocially mobile. There's no hiding out period. It has to follow the mother right from birth and to keep following it continually. And it simply has to keep up. Within 10 minutes of birth, that animal has to keep up with the mother, certainly within a day. And so, the dairy physiology, as it were, of wildebeests, which are closely related to dairy cattle, is all geared for this extreme adaptation, in which you take what was a fetus 1 minute into a sprinting locomotory organism within a day. It's perfectly spectacular. And
whereas an elephant will look after its young. An elephant will look after its young simply by its massive size.
Yes.
But you don't go interfering with an elephant's baby.
Well, that's right. That's right.
So it can be quite wobbly when it's small, but its mother's going to look after it.
That's right. Anthony, from your point of view, you've deeply considered dairy products and particularly mineral nutrients in your own research. What are your thoughts on the mineral nutrient profile of dairy product in the context of human foods in general?
I don't think, Anthony, that it's that milk is particularly special for any mineral element. You would need to drink a huge amount to get your daily requirement for zinc or copper or selenium. Of course, all these elements are in there, are in the milk. But given the quantities we drink, I don't think it's particularly meaningful for any nutrients other than calcium, which is beyond the Goldilocks zone and causing a problem with magnesium. So I don't see it as particularly useful food for preventing subclinical deficiencies of any mineral. There is a salt in milk that I'm very interested in and keen to get your view, Margaret. I don't know if you've delved into choline at all. It's technically an ammonium salt. It has a nitrogen atom in its center and carbon atoms around it. It's a remarkably important molecule for cell membranes, neurotransmitter synthesis, liver function, homocysteine metabolism, etc. And I've been deeply puzzled as to how humans can get enough choline if the recommended daily allowance of in the literature is correct. It's something like 550 milligrams a day of choline that we need to perform all these functions. And well, you get a bit of it in milk, but you need to drink 240 milliliters of milk to get like 40 milligrams of choline. And
what about eggs?
Eggs can give you some. Yes, it's richer, but what I've realized is that you need to eat an enormous amount of eggs, liver, some seafoods, meat every day to get your 550 milligrams. And so my hypothesis is that if that 550 milligrams per day is correct, then most of the human population across the globe is horribly subclinically deficient in choline. It's just something I've been wondering about. I don't think milk solves the choline problem. And is this something you look at in your practice, Margaret?
Well, I mean, if you just think of the nervous system, acetylcholine is so important.
Yeah.
I've always thought that eggs were your best source, but you don't think so?
No, they are. They're liver and eggs, but I can have a quick look here, but I think you'd need to eat 3 or 4 eggs every day to get your choline levels up.
But I think the scare against eggs was quite harmful from that point of view. And not just that.
Interesting.
There's zeaxanthin in the egg yolk, the particular carotenoid that protects your eyes from macular degeneration. That's another thing that, you talked about how advice to avoid the sun has been disastrous because of the vitamin D, but advice to avoid the cholesterol in eggs has been a disaster from the point of view of human eyes.
Yeah, I've just had a look on ChatGPT, assuming it's correct information. You need 4 eggs a day. So 28 eggs a week. I don't think there are many people doing that. Of course, you'll get choline through some other parts of your diet, but it's going to be mainly liver and eggs. So I don't know how one goes about being choline replete. How do you get enough? I suggest supplements are necessary, but it seems like a topic that really isn't discussed much.
And Anthony, what are the symptoms of subclinical deficiency in choline in humans?
Well, the liver function, choline deficiency can lead to fat accumulation in the liver. So it's linked into non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And, the neurotransmitter side of things, choline's used to make acetylcholine, affecting muscle control, memory, and mood. So who knows? It could have a major effect on depression and a feeling of well-being. Seems to be something flying under the radar here. It's not. It's very basic maths. The U.S. government says 550 milligrams a day are needed, and if you run the basic numbers, we're getting nowhere near that. None of us.
And what kind? Of course, people now sneer at the bacon and egg breakfast, but it has its place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anthony, what kind of biomolecule is choline? In what category of molecules is it?
It's known as a quaternary ammonium salt. It has nitrogen atom at the center, surrounded by methyl groups, CH3, that are attached to the nitrogen. So it looks like it's a pretty simple molecule.
But it's as distinct from an amino acid, is that correct?
Yes, it's an ammonium salt.
I see.
So it contains glycine with the 4 methyl groups, and then you get the 3 methyl groups, the trimethylglycine, and the 2 methyl groups, the dimethylglycine. It all comes from that. And these are things suggested for autistic people. Well, the Autism Research Institute in the States used to suggest autistic people took dimethylglycine, and trimethylglycine has been suggested for people with heart problems, simply as a methyl donor, because of the homocysteine.
Yes, very interesting. Well, we've arranged a little way beyond dairy, but it's very appropriate because one topic leads to another, and it really becomes a bewildering task to try and balance one's diet. I mean, I've steered shy of eggs recently out of a suspicion that the egg yolk is a kind of a hormonal toxin for me as an elderly male. But I may have to go back on eggs now that I've learned that I'm courting choline deficiency, and so one flips back and forth and ultimately traces some sort of moderate course among all of these things. But to wrap up overall, perhaps wrapping up overall is a fool's errand because it is so complex, and the question of individual variation is so important in this. So it may be impossible to generalize for people in general. For example, for you, Margaret, a certain kind of cheese is a godsend in your diet, and there's no refuting that. But if you were to take a demographic or population level view, it seems to me not too mischievous to suggest that if the world's population were in general to eliminate dairy products completely from their diet, in sharp contrast to the sort of swamping that we experience today of dairy products in the supermarket, the human race wouldn't be too badly off. Would you agree with that?
What would the Maasai live on? Living in dry plains.
Yes, well, the Maasai clearly
to grow crops.
Yes, the Maasai clearly are an exception. But if one can generalize for people in general, as for Homo sapiens in general, and when we're to wave a wand for most of the people, making exceptions for particular situations such as the Maasai. Let me be more specific. If in the Western world we were simply to, hypothetically, to ban all dairy products henceforth, a crazy thought experiment, and then come back in 50 years and see what has happened to human health, it seems to me plausible that overall we'd be better off, because there are certain pros in milk and other dairy products, but the cons, more or less at the population level, at least in a Western industrial, sophisticated society seem to outweigh the pros. There's just too many problems with milk. It's too difficult for most people to navigate all of them, given all of the scientific and propagandized complexities, So overall, at least this is what the point that I've reached in my own life is, after many years of determined and enthusiastic experimentation and trial and error, a lot of it sort of comedic, trying to find a way through this maze of choices with dairy products. At the end of it all, I've come out basically feeling that I can just rule out all of it and not be worse off. And I suspect that's true for people in general. And that definitely does not contradict the fact that for you it's a wonderful food in the form of cheese, and for the Maasai it's an essential food in the form of clabber and butter. But overall, it just seems to be something that's prominent in our diets, mainly because of the principle of follow the money. It suits certain interests to promote milk and to inculcate in the population a demand for milk and dairy products. But it's not actually human food overall.
What about India, where you have yogurt, which gives you some vitamin B12? Otherwise, you tend to be living on vegetarian food.
Yes. Well, India is
that's another plus. I mean, I think you're going too far. I would say, first of all, have variety in the diet, because you're more likely to get everything you need if you have a lot of different foods, and you're also less likely to get too much of the bad things. Eat cheese rather than milk to get rid of the sugar. Eat vegetables rather than fruit, because you can get your vitamins and minerals from your vegetables rather than the fruit. Keep off the sugar. Keep off keep off bad processing. I mean, making butter and cheese, I think, is good processing. And I think our ancestors knew, if you wanted to eat wheat, which grows in cold places like this country, what you do, first of all, you take the outside off and throw it to the pigs, and then you slowly ferment the rest, and you make it edible. So that sort of processing, I think, is good, rather than cheap, very fast made bread or wholemeal, which has a lot of downsides to it.
Yes.
So eat starch rather than sugar.
Yes. Well, you mentioned India, and that raises one of the most delicious conundrums in this whole, spectrum of topics. Because if you look at the region from Tibet through the Indian subcontinent and then eastwards into China, you have an amazing set of contradictions. For example, in the Chinese region, as I understand it, dairy products are generally not consumed, which is already biologically fascinating, because the Chinese people started domesticating animals probably 10,000 years ago, and they've had every opportunity to create a dairy industry spontaneously and locally, and yet it doesn't seem to have happened. When you move to Tibet, it's essentially the case that yak butter is such an important part of their diet in that cold environment that they couldn't live without it. In fact, they drink tea that's basically butter. The tea is just a flavoring for basically yak butter. And then when you move into the Indian subcontinent, where it's predominantly Hindu culture, you have the most fascinating puzzle, because in the Hindu value system, milk is so sacred, is regarded as such an important item culturally and presumably dietarily, that the bovine animal is sacred in a way that allows it to wander around in modern streets in priority to motor vehicles. So how are we to explain the fact that in the Hindu mind, in the Hindu culture, milk is given such prominence to the point that it's not just a revered food, but it's actually a sacred food? And particularly in view of the fact that, as far as I know, Hindu people do not make cheese. They consume. They make paneer, do they?
Yes, which is a form of sweets. But you put, as far as I understand it, you put lemon in the milk. You sour the milk with lemon, so it's not the same process as we would do.
Yes, and so from from our point of view, most Indian consumers of milk are consuming it in relatively unprocessed form, and yet
Mostly it's yogurt.
most is yogurt. Now, yogurt is a fermented food. It has been affected by lactobacillus, but I've come to the conclusion after studying it for many years that it's really a minimal processing. You've still got all the galactose. You've still got all the problems with the proteins and so on. Yogurt is certainly better than raw milk, but it's just one step removed. And so
it'll have some vitamin K2 in it.
And it has a bit of vitamin K2, correct. But what I'd like to leave listeners with is a fundamental puzzle to ponder, and that is that in India, in the Indian subcontinent, and in the Hindu culture in particular, you have a combination of an emphasis on milk without the problems that we've been discussing. So the Indian people seem to somehow to know something we don't, in the sense that they're getting the best out of milk somehow in combination with an essentially vegetarian diet, in a way that does not require the extreme processing and extreme juggling of factors that we've been discussing. And at the moment I have no idea how that fits in. The Hindu approach to milk is just very puzzling to me.
Well, if you don't have eggs and you don't have meat and you don't have fish, where are you going to get your vitamin B12 from? Assuming, you didn't have shops with vitamin B12.
Yes. So what you're suggesting there is the vitamin B12 factor is so overwhelmingly important that in that context, in that Indian context, it outweighs most other negative factors. Yes. Anthony, have you got anything any thoughts on that?
I was just looking at how much vitamin K2 there is in yogurt, and you'd need to eat a huge amount to get your daily diet, but a daily requirement. But I do think that the power of vitamin K2 is a greatly underestimated power in most discussions on nutrition, much like choline. I think there are these potentially catalytic aspects like vitamin K2 that can make a big difference. So if the Indians are eating yogurt, then I think that might explain how they staving off the horrible correlations with milk consumption that you see in Europe. That would be my personal take on it, just speculating, of course.
Margaret, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the other thing is, you may feel that Indians eat a lot of yogurt, but they're not eating a lot of processed tins and packet food like Westerners, who are getting far more milk than they appreciate through all these things. So it may be that the amount of yogurt that people have in India is nothing like the amount of milk that people are drinking here. I suspect that's true. I mean, I've stayed with friends in India, but obviously I don't know how the amount they eat of yogurt is typical of the population at large. But if it is, I suspect it is not such a huge amount.
Yes, that seems very reasonable. So what we're framing it as is a case of the Hindu reverence for milk is more that the milk is an essential supplement to diets rather than a central item of diets. And that makes perfect sense, because something can be revered and sacred without being particularly numerous or quantitatively important. And so it seems that one of the big problems in our Western diets is just too much dairy products overall. It's just we're just swamped in it, much as we are swamped in sugar. And so we have at least two tasks in our quest for an intelligent use of dairy products in the modern world. And one is to just reduce the amount, and then take what's left and select and process appropriately to get the best out of it with the the maximum benefits and the minimum detriments.
You did touch also on frequency of consuming things, because this is something we've wondered about milk.
Yeah.
If you're having cups of tea and coffee and, as I say, your custard tarts or your packet soup or whatever, you can be having an awful lot of hits of sugar at your body in the course of 24 hours. And if we're thinking of it as of heart disease as being an allergic disease, the milk fat globule membrane is triggering antibodies,
Yes.
that may be far worse than just the simple quantity you're getting through. And
Yes.
if I compare that with, say, people, say, in Kenya, rural people in Kenya, who might have some tea with some milk in the morning, and they might have some midday, they might have some in the evening, and they might only hit their bodies with it 3 times. Whereas, and as well as the amount not being so big, if you have a small cow and it's feeding quite a lot of members of the family, you're not actually having that quantity either. That's very different from the British, who certainly will tend to have milk with breakfast, milk mid-morning, milk at lunch, mid in the afternoon, mid in the evening, and mid at bedtime, very likely. So if it's an allergic thing and you're throwing this stuff at the body a lot more times in the day, that may well be more of a problem. We don't know.
Yes,
but
I
it's
see.
plausible.
Yes. Well, and beyond the allergic response to the membrane around the fat globules within milk, are there any other allergic problems in milk that you'd like to mention to listeners?
I suspect I have a cow milk allergy, and therefore I'm better with goat.
Yes, I see.
Every child I saw, they thought had cancer, who was brought up on goat milk, had an allergy to goat. So the proteins are different. And obviously there are lots of other animals you could get your milk from. So yeah, in general, if you're allergic to the milk of one animal, and genuinely allergic as opposed to having lactose intolerance, then switching to another animal makes sense.
Yes. Well, we could probably go on for days discussing milk, but we've covered most of the basic aspects. Anthony, do you think that there are any major categories that we haven't touched on?
No, I think it's been a comprehensive, wide-ranging discussion. Thanks, Anthony.
Yeah.
Many thanks, Margaret.
Yes, thank you, Margaret. And to close off, Margaret, again, for listeners, could you please mention, I know you have before, but once again, mention how can listeners find you if they wish to consult you? What's the easiest way to find Margaret Moss out there?
The easiest way is to find nutritionist resource online. Because if I give you an email address, or it's difficult, you can make smaller errors in it and you can't get it, or the same with the phone number, but nutritionist resource is fairly easy to get. If you look up salicylate sensitivity, something like that, that will come up high up on Google, and that will just take you straight to an article I wrote, because not many people write it. It's not like if you put in breast cancer, I'd come on page number 1,000 or something, but yes. So few people write about salicylate intolerance or salicylate sensitivity. That yes. brings, I think, more people to me than anything else does.
Fascinating. Salicylates being a component of aspirin, not so?
Yeah, well, salicylic acid is your aspirin.
Yes.
So related to that, yes. And a lot of people are looking for a practitioner who understands what to do if you've got those problems.
Yes.
And
well, that's
wonderful. Not many people that they can find.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Finding a good practitioner, a good consultant in diet and health in general is indeed a never-ending quest. And so I'm sure your expertise is going to be valuable to many people who've tried many other things and have kind of torn their hair out in desperation. So thank you, Margaret. It's been an absolute privilege and wonderfully beneficial to have you here. to hear some of your views. We haven't exhausted the topic by any means, but at least I think listeners will be left with a sense of how complex it is and how open-minded one has to remain in terms of considering the pros and benefits in order to sort of trace a sensible course through the problem in life with respect to modern diets replicating our original natural diets. There's a tendency to go paleo these days, and many people think that paleo is just eating fatty beef, whereas nothing like that is the case. I mean, to become paleo, you need to do it in a much more nuanced and balanced way. And dairy can be part of that paleo approach if one knows enough and if one has enough personal experience with one's own personal physiology, because it's the individual that really counts. We are so different as humans that what applies to one individual simply doesn't apply to another. And so you have to factor that in. And so thanks very much, Margaret. It's been an absolute joy. And to listeners, listeners of Exploring the BioEdge, please like, subscribe, and share. And we look forward to seeing you for our next episode. And good night to you all.